So my colleague here, Harsh Mittal, is responsible for this work as well. I'm here to, so any blame that needs to be shared, uh, you know, uh, uh, and also that he helped reliven my interest in urban studies. After a point, I was completely after about several years of looking at urbanism, critically looking at urban space, urban planning, I was fairly thoroughly disillusioned with what's the point of doing this. The way in which authoritarian sort of tendencies in urban planning get translated into politics was so strong that beyond a point I sort of saw that there was no point, but his involvement in saying that there are many new things that one should be looking at, and it was because of his involvement I also started thinking seriously about smart cities. But that's his PhD thesis, and I don't want to tread on your toes here, so we'll for now stay here. So there we have this presentation, but to be honest, what's been vexing me for the last several days um, kind of wants me to start somewhere else, not with like the first slide or the title, somewhere in the middle, and I'll find a way of trying to do that by flipping through by this first visual. Uh, it's slightly off the title is up here. It says Budhan Theatre, Nomads and Thieves, thieves in quotes. Now for anybody who's familiar with the Budhan Theatre, they have a 20-year history of energizing the theatre scene in Ahmedabad. They belong to a community called the Charas. There's been a lot of work, academic work, as well as theatre activism done by the Chara community that was recently attacked by the police. It was one of the most brutal attacks, singular attacks on the police, although there have been many in Ahmedabad. But this one is particularly, and why I'm jumping to this right away in this presentation, and I'll sort of talk about this a bit more, is that here's a scene here in which police brutality is actually being enacted in one of the plays of the Chara community or the Budhan Theatre. It's called Budhan Bolta Hai, and most of the early plays were inspired by Mahashweta Devi's writings about Budhan Savar in Bengal, and were about police brutality. This recent event of police brutality is definitely not new for them, but to me it's like a completely sort of a rupture in some kind of a narrative that I had been developing in my mind, that if one looks at what the Budhan Theatre had been doing in the last sort of 20 years since Mahashweta Devi, Ganesh Devi and others had come and contributed and started this. Here, I mean, there's too small to read, but these are Google searches and YouTube searches for Budhan Theatre. You get hundreds of links about plays, about the Ahmedabad Theatre Festival 2012. It was the largest citywide theatre festival organized by the Budhan Theatre, where you had over 70 to 75 theatre groups from all over the country. So this is a very nationally and internationally, in terms of arts and culture, a community that is highly well known for arts and for theatre-based transformation of their own community. About a week ago or 10 days ago, a brutal police attack for the same reasons that they had been fighting for 20 years to rid themselves of the label of thieves and bootleggers and liquor makers, as if none of these 20 years had happened. The police simply said that this is a community of bootleggers. So all the stuff that we have, books have been written about it, about the transformations caused by the Budhan Theatre in the Chara community. There are over 200 lawyers in the Chara community in Charanagar. The artist, there is an IGNU center at Charanagar. So all of these things, none of this matters. The only thing that is justified in using police brutality, over 400 cops go and do this. There was a conflagration. There was a conflict with some young shopkeepers there. But the kind of force that's been used really creates this rupture. And why this is in the middle of the, this somewhere in the middle of the presentation, but I want to talk about it right up front, is that this rupture sort of ruptures this coherence. Forget my presentation, but there's also the coherence of the way in which we live life in the city. At least for me, I don't see the point of making a coherent sort of presentation. The coherence has literally been, now I realize, I mean, when it's not now, it's not new, but the idea of coherence is fairly fake, right? It's a construction that we have so that we can make sense and order of the world, right? It doesn't really exist. Our social lives aren't coherent, right? And what the internet narrative of the Budhan Theatre and Charanagar and all of these things have, 20 years worth, and Dakshin Chara, one of the most well-known members of the community, has directed a Bollywood film. It's been shown in 7 countries. He's been invited to give talks around this film. So none of this really sort of matters. So that's the kind of incoherence that I'm trying to figure out, because the cops can at will go into his house, beat up his family, take children out from their homes, arrest them, with the same language that was being used more than 20 years ago. Why does this happen? Why is my narrative of coherence being disrupted? And I realized that I'm quite invested in my narrative of coherence. As an academic, I'm deeply invested in it. I have to tell you a straightforward story, right? That's what I get paid for, basically. I invest in a Fab India shirt because it helps me feel more comfortable about telling, quote unquote sad stories while working for the state. I work for the state, I work for a public institution, the state institution. On the other hand, I tell stories here which look at the state as a very particularly very evil actor. So I'm invested in the coherence that comes with something that doesn't really belong to the way in which social lives are actually lived out. Where does this come from? Why am I so invested? And I'd like to sort of go to another place where I feel very invested in the coherence of things. Yeah? This is, I don't know if anybody's been to Gurgaon. Has anyone been to Gurgaon, to this place, Cyber Hub, or heard of it? Now there's something that suggests that this thing is kind of otherworldly, right? Definitely not a very Indian look, or maybe it's an Indian imaginary that has finally come to root. It has come to root. These are actual photographs of this place called Cyber Hub. This is fantastic. I can walk in with this Fab India shirt with my, efforts at telling a great story, etc. And the next minute I can be over here as a good citizen. Good citizens belong in places like this because we consume. That's what makes us good citizens. We consume these fantasies. We spend money. I do get a lot of money for, making sure that my story is coherent. There's no doubt about it. So this is the space that I inhabit, regardless of what else I invest myself in. And I'm a good citizen because I'm a good consumer. This is the idea of fantasy with which I'm viewing urban planning, right, is exactly this. It's producing me to be a good citizen of a certain kind while continuing to disrupt. If at all I have a coherent narrative, I'm sort of able to tell these stories without talking about these ruptures, by justifying these ruptures in the narrative through criminality, right? And this is what the idea that I'm trying to talk about, I'm going to try and spell out a little bit more here. Excuse me. Is a relationship between fantasy, the way in which this desire is produced in me. I'm a desiring subject, right? I have certain desires. They come from somewhere. They're produced in me through planning organizations of the kind of life that I would like to have, right? So I sign on, I go vote, or do or click like, or whatever it is that I'm supposed to do, so that such realities do get produced for me. In turn, I get some other things produced for me too, to feel safe in places like this. If I have to feel safe in places like this, somewhere else, particularly in a place like Charanagar, is going to constantly feel unsafe, because the forces that are protecting me in places like this are the forces that are keeping people who are considered criminal or who are considered, for whatever reason, are keeping them out, are keeping them in camps. So I'm trying to here develop an understanding that fantasy is necessarily needs the idea of a camp and of policing. And the state primarily deals with us as separate subjects, some of which live in this world of fantasy, the world that I live in, and some of us will necessarily, to serve my needs of living in fantasy, will necessarily have to live in that world of camps, such that terror can be exercised on their worlds at any given point of time, so that the boundaries, the jurisdictions where they stay, the camps, are not going to transgress the spaces that I inhabit. The fantastic spaces that I inhabit are not going to be inhabited by them. Here's another visual. Just 2 weeks before last year, September 2017, a few weeks before the Japanese Prime Minister and the First Lady of Japan visited us in Ahmedabad, that's what the riverfront looked like. The riverfront in Ahmedabad looked like this. It was underwater. This was sold to us as a flood control measure, right? As an engineering and planning marvel that would protect Ahmedabad from the floods. There had been 2 floods in Ahmedabad in the last 30 years. And there has been economic calculation of costs and loss of life, all of that. We've had more than 6 floods after the riverfront has actually been built. And I'm not a geologist. I cannot tell you whether it was because the monsoon has been excessively bad in Ahmedabad, right? The monsoon has been excessively bad in Ahmedabad, isn't it right? It's been raining almost every day, and it's been filling our campuses up. That would probably explain the kind of flooding we have, and not the marvel that has been produced here. Since I'm not a trained, whatever the technical term is for this, so I can't say that. But I just leave it to you here. The kind of money that was spent, public money that was spent, to make sure that the riverfront looks like this. This is an actual picture 2 weeks later, to welcome our international guests. So for me, this sense of what public resources are being used for, right? To whom should these fantasies speak to, right? These are all part of physical plans. They're all part of master planning activities. We have the best trained folks there. I have no right or talk about qualifications and competence, etc. And then the next thing, once I see this together, I just wish, wouldn't be nice, now that we have the Japanese at the riverfront, it would absolutely. This is a picture I got off the net. I haven't photoshopped this. Somebody else has. I mean, I'm trying to be honest over here. This is on the net. I mean, you can look for it and find this. This is on the net as well. This is not photoshopped. The one on the right. I mean, I couldn't tell if it was. That looked kind of, because this looks like neither Ahmedabad nor Mumbai in the background. So it's easier to make that claim. I mean, you can say that, I don't have good photographs, that's fine. But the way in which this previous image sets up our readiness for experiencing more fantasy, right? What our transportation needs are in this country, who needs what kind of transportation, where are the necessary networks needed, what are the networks needed for economic supply, for all sorts of things. Whether we are interested in understanding anything about this or not, that's not the objective anymore. The objective is to move from a situation of this kind. I mean, just imagine getting to the airport in 3 minutes. Wouldn't that be nice? I mean, 5 7 minutes, and avoid the whole city, this pollution and this sort of traffic, and who wants to hear the honking and this bad air quality? Why would we deal with that? Here's the thing: just like 3 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever, and you don't even experience anybody or anything else. I know who I'm going to vote for. Certainly do. I want this. Why is state making and fantasy for me a very important part of neoliberal governance? And I say neoliberal governance, neoliberal governing, because like I gave the example earlier of myself being a very perfect neoliberal subject, because as a good citizen, my value is in my consumption. It's not in the value of my raising questions to government or to critiquing government's programs or where we are going as a nation or who the nation is or who we are as a people and which people, none of those things, but as a good consumer, right? The background of this is that the purpose of state planning actually becomes instilling a futurist technical imagination on space, right? And this is done in various ways. There are various kinds of political mobilizations that lead to this. And this technical imagination is particularly invoked when we talk about the bullet train or we talk about infrastructure, very high-tech infrastructure and things like this. The irony is that fantasy itself is a deeply it's a deeply felt sense of subjectivity, different kind of subjectivities, of desire, of hunger, longing, anger, anxiety, vulnerability, all of those things. Though that's what part of this human subjectivity is, that fantasy actually evokes. So this curious juxtaposition of fantasy and the technical imagination is something else that sort of I would like to put up here to be examined. Second is that it actually structures a collective reality. We do believe, in Ahmedabad, I've been living here for a while now, that we are one of the best, most urban, we are an urban model for India. We have about 7 to 10 awards, national awards and international awards, for the best something of our urban character. Whether it's the best public transportation system in the BRTS, or it's the best road system, or it's the Sabarmati riverfront project, which has 3 awards, 2 international and 1 national, or there are others as well. So it's this sort of bringing these together do give this a sense of our collective identity as a people, that we do belong, and this is our what's that word? This is our destiny. So there's not much by way of question. Why would you question it if that's our destiny and it looks so good? Why would you not want this to be our destiny? Who would not want this to be our destiny? People who would not want this to be our destiny are definitely troublemakers. They are not on board this wonderful vehicle, the bullet train or whatever, that's going to take us to these places. And something is going to be done to them such that this fantasy does not get ruptured, does not get disrupted. What, again, this idea of fantasy invokes is it promises a kind of a materialization, that is problem solving. We have a problem of floods, here's a project that will solve it, right? So idea of fantasy is also to reduce collective anxieties and renders the world into a satisfactory, calming state. Ideologically free. Nobody is talking about floods being an ideological problem. So why are we talking about the Sabarmati riverfront project being an ideological project? That's crazy, right? Anybody who says that, it sounds crazy. Why? Because floods is a problem for everybody. And the fact that it's been solved solves a problem for everybody. There's nothing ideological about this. Once expressed in this language, it's very hard now to talk about how public resources are sequestered and allocated selectively to certain very visible projects and where they get taken away from. One of the places they get taken away from very clearly is from, for example, the Pirana landfill. If anybody has been to Pirana landfill, the dump site, you could see that there is, if the Japanese were sitting there and then we talked about the bullet train, I don't think people would have believed that there is even that photoshopped image possible. So there's a real, nice, I mean, let's try and do this. Let's try and stage events at the Pirana landfill and say that we are going to go into the 22nd century as the best urban model of India, and see how that goes with people. How many people will get on board is the question. So there's a very good reason. I think I must credit them for thinking very well on this, that they're not using the Pirana landfill. Um, so these people who aren't on board, or these places that aren't on board, they don't look like this. What fantasy allows is to deport them. There's a material relocation or an invisibilization of problems into camps. They are kept away from the gaze of a camera or the gaze of the public eye. Right? We don't really see the Pirana landfill in all sorts of popular images about Ahmedabad. I'm just using that as stock example. I could use many other places, but that's just one. Right? Why? Because it allows the fantasy of perfect control. If you keep focusing on Ahmedabad as the riverfront, the way in which this image shows, and how the Japanese saw it, and maybe others, I mean, whoever, not, I mean, everybody isn't walking around the riverfront isn't Japanese. Some of us are certainly not. But on the other hand, if that's what it is, then it does provide us an example of perfect control that is possible, and it moves things away into these things that we've called camps, based on the literature of modern refugee camps. We have looked at the work of Romola Sanyal, Sylvia Pascheri, and a whole bunch of other authors who talk about modern day refugee camps, and how modern day refugee camps and slums, urban slums, aren't very different at all. They are policed in order to keep people in. They are policed in certain ways that people go out only to work, and at beyond a certain number of hours, they can't be anywhere else except back in that camp. If you find somebody from these spaces in upmarket residential neighborhoods, somebody will complain, especially if there are more than one person. If there are 5 people or 10 people or 15 people, there will definitely be a police car that will come and check on them, ask for ID and things like this. This happens here all the time. And especially in places that are not gated communities. I live in I'm a very good citizen. I live in a gated community. So I don't call the police and say that there are people lurking outside, because I don't need to. All of that happens much beyond the boundaries of the wall which protect me. These camps are also characterized. They are ordered in a certain way in overall space. They are also characterized by enduring temporariness. This is a quality that says that they are only here for some time until things get better. Because after all, the national income of the country improves, everybody's situations get better, they won't be here forever. So the idea of not being here forever means that it's temporary. But what that temporariness indicates, one doesn't really know. How many centuries could it be, or decades? We have no idea. But it's definitely not permanent. And that lack of permanence also serves a very useful role for the state. If they need that space, they can have it. Space doesn't belong to folks. They're not property rights holders. Right? It's also a place of custody and confinement. These are the spaces that are heavily policed. So the Sardar Nagar police station has had a very special relationship with Charanagar. It's by no means innocuous, and it's been well documented, right? When Dakshin and his colleagues did these plays at the police academy in Gandhinagar, and there were a lot of questions raised. Some of the police officers who had served at Sardar Nagar knew what they were talking about, and they admitted, yes, our role is to make sure, and we have a manual. They have a manual about criminal tribes and their characteristics. It's from the British era. It's still used in these police stations to basically identify people who are from these communities every time that there is a crime in the area, to go and catch them first. They've also found ways to decode their language. So the idea of confinement and protective custody of the state question is protective for whom? Is it for them, or protective for areas around Kuber Nagar, Sardar Nagar, and what is legitimately called Ahmedabad? Charanagar has a tough time calling itself part of Ahmedabad because it's never really mentioned as part of Ahmedabad. Sardar is, right? So this legitimacy of jurisdiction also tells you what's a camp, what's not a camp. And then finally, two other things, care and coercion. Coercion is at will, the police can go in for a minor transgression. Now, I grew up in Delhi. There's a place in Delhi called Vasant Vihar. It's a very elite residential neighborhood, right? Forget about illegal alcohol. There was all kind of other illegal substances at the social gatherings that I attended, right? But there was no question of any police coming and bothering us, right? There was none. Even if they did, there would never be anything more than a payoff. In Charanagar, if 400 police people go in and beat folks up, it shows the kind of coercion that these camps are open to. And one more word, care. Care is about how people like me and many others who, like, generally want to help other folks. We have a moral do-gooding kind of a thing. We set up NGOs, and we said that we'll go, one weekend we'll set up a little room. We go and teach some children, or we'll talk to them about the evils of brewing alcohol, or something or the other. So there's a social institutional network, what often gets called civil society organizations, that provide care. The state, in fact, leaves populations of a certain kind in these camps such that they would be provided care, not by the state, but by what are called civil society organizations, which Mona has written about, and the way in which they form part of state politics as well. So these are the four major characteristics of camps. How is this sold in the beginning, and why don't we see these things in this way? It's quite obvious. I'm putting myself aside. And this is what I find really attractive when I see hoardings of real estate companies. I see this is the kind of life that I want. This is the kind of place where I want this nice green space, tall buildings. There's a gym. These beautiful flowers, like it's Holland always. There are these sort of skyscraper. I don't know. There are these places where people drinking wine. It's not here, not Gujarat. This is Noida, so we don't do that here. Art gallery. This is this is Noida, of course. It's okay. It's legal. It's okay. And then there's Gurgaon here. I used to think that these renditions would never sort of come true. Architects' renditions of this space, I've been seeing them from 2003, 4, but when I actually visited this place, I was completely, taken aback. I was really thrilled. Wow, they can actually make this. It's great. It's wonderful. And this is the camp that enables this kind of space. My experience of that fantasy is enabled by, this is the demolished site of the workers in Gurgaon who built the Cyber Hub. This is right after the Cyber Hub was complete. When Cyber Hub gets complete, their contracts come to an end. They are daily wage workers, most of them. And this is the condition in open plots where they actually live. This is enabled. There's nothing illegal about this, by the way. You might find this very shocking, or maybe not. I don't know. This is quite normal because this is enabled. None of the labor laws were violated here. They don't own anything where they lived. Till the time the project is on, they're provided a temporary settlement, right? They provided a camp. They actually call it a camp. It gets demolished the day after. They have no access, right? They have no idea where they're going to go next. Some people are shipped off to another construction site if they have managed to have a good relationship with the contractor's foreman. This was the housing, though, while the Cyber Hub was being built. So the physical work that gets done on sites like this, that are planned globally, that look a certain way, that provide me this fantasy, this is the way in which the people who are actually making this is not demolished. This is like the best functioning part of the construction project. And this is the best time to see workers' housing. This is what it looks like at the best of times, right? So the one that was demolished looked what it did. This is how it looks later. And this is after demolition, when people couldn't get away, when people didn't have jobs, some people moved away, some others didn't. They tried to reconstruct whatever little they had on that time, hoping that for that, till the next meal time, nobody drives them away, so they can cook and eat and whatever. But this is the sort of broad contrast if you look at the politics that is mobilized to show us the things are getting better as long as you fit in one of these images. Your aspirations and your desires align with the fantasy of one of these images. And if it doesn't align with this, then you're obviously not going to be happy. These people look really happy. This is Cyber Hub again, and it's an architect's rendition prior to it being built. It actually looks even better after it's being built than in the architect's rendition. And I say better without any quotes. Aesthetics. This is next to you. These are images of a site right next to you. A lot of gift city. Are you surprised? These are architects' renditions of the gift city. You don't see these buildings at night lit up right next to you. There must be some tall tower here at IIT from where you can see them, I'm sure. Maybe there are lots of trees and you're not able to see them. But I'm too far. I don't know, so I'm asking. I mean, how do I know? So these are some of the architects' renditions of the gift city. This is what mobilized investors. This is what mobilized many of the awards. So the gift city also got an award prior to it being built. It's already declared a smart city. It's not there. It's a smart city, right? Yeah. The smart cities expert, so I'm just checking. So the fantasy of what is politically possible and the kind of citizen who I want to be is strongly mediated by neoliberal politics. Politics that mobilizes my desires in certain ways, in certain directions, but also creates life for some others in remarkably different ways. But the argument here is it's not that one day that will get better, that more of that is necessary, more of the violence in Charanagar is necessary, more state violence in these construction sites is necessary once places like these are built, so that there are enough disposable pool of workers to build the next fantasy. It's not by accident that this has happened, not neglect, not lack of awareness, not because some NGOs didn't do their job. This is provided for by law. So this is a picture of Mr. Modi when he was Chief Minister. We have the architect of the riverfront, Dr. Bimal Patel. We have Mr. I.P. Gautam, who's the commissioner of the city, the municipal commissioner, looking at prior to the construction of the riverfront project as it is, looking at this plan. This was the plan rendered by the architect of this place, and Mr. Modi asks what these sites are. So here's the sort of font of political power of the state, looking at a rendition of space so that questions can be asked. This kind of a godlike aerial view type of relationship between a viewer and this map. This is how maps actually function, right? Maps externalize space, flatten it out, and then people can ask what this is. This was supposed to be a rehabilitation site. You know, the argument was, do you really want it over here? Why don't we have just like a completely sanitized space over here so we can do lots of things? If some of these people are still going to be here, then it's not going to be what we want. So why don't we move them somewhere else? And as a consequence of that, they were moved nowhere. So the people who lived in the riverbanks had to wage a 10-year-long struggle, go to court, use civil society, vehicles, media, all sorts of things, and finally win their right to rehabilitation, right? So this way in which plan making as a fantasy renders power to be enacted, power to be exercised, right, is also particularly striking. That planning isn't a neutral activity using tools, graphics, and softwares, but it's used in certain ways. It's used to make political decisions about how people should live, where they should live, how should spaces be organized. And when you talk about organization of spaces, they obviously mean organization of populations. Creating order on a map is about creating relationships or recreating relationships, circulation of society, of social groups, and relationships within them. It's not as innocuous as simply saying what's convenient and what's not convenient. So one argues that fantasy planning is an anti-politics machine, right? It's practiced through distance and abstraction. And how much time do I have? 2 minutes? 5 minutes? Okay. It's practiced through distance and abstraction. And there's a particular modernist aesthetic. I've spent a lot of time on looking at these images and I'm trying to run through. Specific modernist aesthetic which allows a wicked problem, whether it's a problem of pollution or flooding or bad traffic or whatever, to be rendered into something tame that is, by using planning approaches, they can be solved. That's basically what it does. So the idea is that it's depolitical. It's the anti-politics machine means this is not a political project at all. It's simply a problem-solving project. The way in which it's actually, so fantasy, the language of fantasy planning uses this particular technical imagination, though it's deeply rooted in desire and sort of other kind of subjectivities. So this practice of high modernism, what it does in planning and state making is to erase history and politics from space, and therefore enables exercise of politics by other means. I sort of don't want to spend too much time on technical imagination. We've gone through this, but this is a sort of a quick, again, as Chief Minister in 2010 or 11, this was a statement on the riverfront project. Again, political support for the riverfront project, where the Chief Minister says the riverfront project will transform Ahmedabad historic but neglected riverfront into a vibrant and vital focus for the city. The project consists of several linked initiatives aimed at addressing the many environmental and social problems of the riverfront. The social problems were that they were sort of occupied by the poor. That is primarily what one heard of what the riverfront social problems were. This is, and they also said it's a participatory planning project. There were these spaces, art galleries, where people were. This is the art gallery at next to Kanoria Art Center, next to the Gufa. It's a very sort of an open space. Most of Ahmedabad's residents come here very often, especially people affected by evictions from the riverfront. They come and visit the art galleries quite often, such that they would have very normally walked in and talked about whether these plans in these visual images look good or not. And then another strategy of public participation was to publish these photographs in English language newspapers and then ask sort of citizens of the city. One is Anil Relia, who actually owns and runs the art gallery that was where the exhibition was displayed, and the other one is a very well-known artist here. So, okay, I mean, fair enough. These are also citizens of Ahmedabad. Nothing wrong with that. But so this is the kind of participatory planning that happened around the riverfront. So when we talk about public participation, it happened. Then we have Charanagar. We've already talked a little bit more about this. I have a video clip, but I won't show this to you. It's a news item from 2 days ago. The idea of clean water, clean resources, better delivery of services, and rehabilitation didn't really work out. Many of these places from where people were evicted into new houses still got water that was quite contaminated. We had it tested. The housing looked like this in the interim. Some people stayed there for 7 years to 10 years. Some people still live here now who couldn't get into the rehabilitated housing for various reasons. The rehabilitation housing looks a bit like this. Okay, fair enough. It's there. And it came at the back of people's struggles, so I'm not going to knock it. It's good. It wasn't provided by the state as a gift, even though it seems like it's a state project, a state scheme. Yes, state money was used to build these houses, but without the public interest litigation, there would be none of this housing for people who were evicted from the riverfront. The smart city fantasies are also pretty much in line with this narrative, and Harsh is being studied this in great detail. Most of these things happen in glitzy conference venues, hotels, etc. The main actors are for-profit developers and IT firms, global consulting houses. Their clients are IT firms. The agenda in these smart city conferences shifts more and more away. There's hardly any talk about things like equity, and the poor and conflicts over. I mean, there's never any mention of any of this. Once a deputy mayor of Shimla did bring in, he belonged to the CPI, so he brought in these issues into a conference, but he lost the elections after that. There's no more scope of having these conversations. Um, Finally, I like to look at this. When you widen up the Ahmedabad model, it tells you a little bit more about the state of the nation also. There is an entire state that lives as a camp, right? This is a picture of school children who walked out of their school, pictures taken by a journalist there, who were sort of who were sexually harassed by people in uniform. And as a consequence of that, there was a conflagration, and it led to what is very commonly known now as stone pelting. Right? This is a master craftsman who went to many international venues with his work, a weaver, who was used as a human shield in front of a jeep. So the rupture narrative about the Indian state and who it protects continues over here. I don't know how to resolve this, as incoherent as that may sound. But it's very clear that camps and the fantasy of order, they do go together. So we have this resurgent super nation that is emerging. At the same time, the camps are places where these kinds of state actions will continue. And they are necessary, in fact, such that our sort of politics is mobilized in a certain way to keep producing these fantasies. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Navdeep, for this very, very evocative, provocative, and thought-provoking, talk with very kind of arresting images, also disturbing images, and the relationship between, the politics of, conveying certain political projects through a certain kind of visualization, which of course you're also describing in a more complex way as fantasy. And such a huge part of this fantasy is the kind of visual element of this fantasy, in the kinds of images we saw of Gurgaon, of the cyber hub. And of course, all of this is rooted in the kind of historical context of our neoliberal times, and you, although you didn't sort of mention or dwell on, what these times are and what are the sort of central political I would say tenets of this kind of neoliberal era. And I think one thing that was central to that, and I think I'll kind of maybe develop that idea, is the idea of the citizen, and who is an ideal citizen in this sort of neoliberal era. And certainly it is a kind of consumer citizen, right? Which is why the goal of a nation also, as our Prime Minister has said, is to become a country that is the most investment friendly, right? That should be the goal, that everything that we do, the cities that we make, the spaces that we build, the kind of economic policies that we produce should all be driven towards increasing the attraction of global capital. And how that is going to really should ideally be the journey of a successful developed society. So you of course talked about how fantasy planning, and I really find that a very, very interesting framework through which this kind of politics is produced, sold, and legitimized. And it's not just about the selling of this politics, but the sort of very, very troubling relationship of this with that, the kind of other concept that is very, very important in the production of fantasy planning is its relation to what you're talking about as camps. right? And as deeply exclusionary spaces that are highly controlled through coercive state power. And what is the relationship between the two? And you had one of those newspaper images of in which you had Raelia's kind of quote, and it was about the Sabarmati riverfront, and it was written by Niyati Rana, and there was a caption which caught my imagination. It says, "When reality meets imagination," you know and I think there is so much that one can sort of ask and reflect on through this very, very, I think, loaded statement. What is the reality, what is the imagination, and the kind of politics that is supposed to sort of make that to bridge the two, right? What I find and perhaps in these are some of the questions that I will now start to articulate, that I wish that you can sort of dwell on further. And others have worked on this as well. For instance, Gertner has talked about also what he's calling the aestheticization of cities, and how aestheticizing cities is a way of depoliticizing also the kind of unequal power equations that are central to this kind of aesthetic production. So, what I find very interesting, I think I will not sort of say much more because I want to hear what you have to say about this. When reality meets imagination has to do with how you sell this kind of politics, these kinds of visuals to citizens who are so impoverished, who are so, kind of on the margins. And how do you produce the kinds of consensus and political support for these kinds of fantasies? It's easy to understand the middle class support for this kind of these kinds of fantasies. I think at one level we kind of almost simplistically assume that the middle class is the obvious audience for these kinds of fantasies, but I think the truth is far more complicated than that. That the middle class alone is not the audience for these kinds of fantasies, and in fact these fantasies cannot beyond a point even be sustained without a larger set of audiences buying into it, right? And I think that's also part of the sort of puzzle of neoliberal politics, which Harvey talks about when he talks about how neoliberalism produces a kind of a very, very cynical kind of common sensical notion of what should be, what ought to be, right? And I wanted, and I'll stop here by asking you what you think are the sort of the different elements of you know uh, the production of support for this kind of fantasy by non-middle class audiences, or from non-middle class audiences, people who are living in low income houses, the vast majority of citizens of the city, you're right, who are not living in gated communities. And I think that these fantasies speak to them as well. And in fact, I think they might even be a very, very important audience for these fantasies. And how do we make sense of, in a kind of democratic framework, a political dispensation kind of getting away or remaining in place by creating these fantasies that seem so completely on the face of it uh, counterintuitive, right? How are these people, how are these regimes going to remain in power if if you just go by the simplistic logic of representative democracy, right? Because a lot more, I think, is going on here in the kind of support that is built for these kinds of fantasies. And I'm quite interested in that aspect of fantasy planning. How, of course, fantasy planning is undemocratic in the sense that it's exclusionary, and we know that. But how does this kind of exclusionary project manage to sustain itself within the framework of representative democracy? What are the sort of elements for that to to succeed and to kind of sustain. So with that I will end, and I would love to hear, you know, your responses to that, and also I think at some point we throw it open to yeah.